hello everybody. My name is Monika Sowińska. I work as a project officer at the European Commission's Directorate for Informatics in the Interoperability unit. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Commission and its open source observatory team, OSOR team for short. Today we have with us Vivienne Deveney, Chloé Dusutour, Deborah Lopes-Gonçalves, and Federico Chiarelli, consultants from Wavestone, the company that supports the European Commission with running the observatory. Actually, we have also today with us OFE team, Open for Europe team, that also works with us and supports us with running the observatory. So welcome you too. And a special welcome to today's speakers. Johan Linåker from Sweden, a researcher at Lund University. Rasmus Frey, Chief Executive and the Head of Secretariat of OS2 Public Digitalization Network, an open source community that develops and governs IT solutions for municipalities in Denmark. And our third speakers that I hope managed to join us by that time, Patrice-Emmanuel Schmitz, a lawyer specializing in open source licensing. Patrice, Rasmus, and Johan, thank you for joining us today to share your knowledge and experience in the field of procuring open source software by public sector organizations. So this is the topic of today, as you all know, and I guess this is the reason of such a big interest in this webinar. I will introduce our speakers in more detail a bit later when we have more participants connected, because I see that there are still some people connecting and we'll probably reach a bit bigger number that we have now. And by the way, I would be really grateful if everyone could introduce yourselves by adding your names in Jitsi, if you haven't done it when connecting to the webinar. You will find this option at the bottom right of the screen. Just click on three dots and you will see an option to add your name. This is really important for us that we know who is today with us. Another important information, if the quality of the Jitsi meeting becomes poor for whatever reason, or we get just disconnected, please check your email because we are going to send connection details for Teams call to continue there. Hopefully it won't be necessary. In the meantime, let's watch a short video about OSOR because we would like to introduce our work to those that don't know us. And there are some new names, as I could see from the registration list. So, Chloé, Vivienne, could you please stream the video now?
Do you want to keep up to date with the latest open source developments in the public sector? Would you like to connect with open source enthusiasts around Europe? Looking for guidance and best practices around the use of open source solutions? OSOR has all you need and is available to everyone. OSOR stands for Open Source Observatory of the European Commission. It is hosted on the JoinUp collaborative platform and brings public administrations and open source communities together. It is a single information point for news, events, case studies, and other invaluable resources on open source initiatives in the public sector in Europe and beyond. They showcase the benefits afforded to users of open source, including interoperability, cost reduction, transparency, and adaptability. Many of these resources are accessible in 24 EU languages. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter and enable our RSS feed and JoinUp notifications so you'll never miss out on key developments in the open source ecosystem. If you want to contribute to our observatory and publish your own articles, all you need to do is become a member. But that's not all. OSOR's key feature is its Knowledge Centre. Here, you can find reports and fact sheets on the development of open source software policies and initiatives in all member states, as well as many countries around the world. You will also find guidelines on how to create and manage sustainable open source projects and communities in the public sector. If you are looking for code to foster the reusability of existing solutions, the Knowledge Centre has a list of repositories used by public administrations. If you want to reach out to other community members, there's a contact list of European open source organisations and competence centres. OSOR's resource pool is continuously expanding, so check in regularly to stay abreast of the latest. Now, let's hear from some of our users.
The most useful and valuable resources for us will be the news articles, since they are frequently updated and they provide us a good baseline of what is happening currently around Europe.
I particularly appreciate the EU's join-up service, especially the Open Source Observatory. Regular webinars, country intelligence reports, extremely helpful to my day job, but also help bolster the open collaboration taking place across the public sector in Europe.
What made me excited about the guidelines for sustainable open source communities in the public sector was specifically that here we have something that's more tangible and that actually has the power to change and influence behavior.
Very few services have been running for as long as OSOR, and in my opinion this is one of the reasons why it is such a great value, along with the quality and breadth of its content.
Join us on OSOR and be part of a community of like-minded individuals who are passionate about public sector open source software.
Thanks. So that was a bit of self-promotion of OSOR. We also have 2 slides on the content of Observatory and our offer that we usually present at our webinars. But since a lot of information was already included in the video, I think that we will just focus on what's new. So Chloe, over to you.
Thank you, Monica. Hello, everyone. Yes, sorry. No problem. Hello, everyone. So as you've seen in the video, in the OSOR homepage, you'll find a lot of information, but I will highlight the OSOR events and also the community events that we have attended that you can find in our page, as well as our newest edition, the interactive map, created to allow the community and visitors to navigate resources such as the country intelligence reports by country. So in a more visually easier way to navigate all information by country. We also have, as mentioned in the video, the Knowledge Center, and the Knowledge Center, as presented in the Discover OSOR video, which is continuously updated and open to contributions from the community. And our guidelines that will be presented today, the updated guidelines on public procurement of open source software, will be for sure included in the Knowledge Center.
Thank you, Deborah. I would just like to add that OSOR has been funded since 2007 by the European Commission via a series of programs focused on interoperability. Programs such IDA, ISA, and ISA Square. I'm not going to explain what they were all about, but of course, main focus was in interoperability. And this work it has been continued under the Interoperable Europe initiative within the Digital Europe program. So OSOR now it's funded by the Digital Europe program. And you can find more information on JoinUp, both about OSOR and Interoperable Europe. I think there is already a link in the chat that we have provided. Hence, today, Interoperable Europe, my background today. So this is the initiative that we are working on now. So now moving to the agenda and our main topic of today, let's have a look at the program. We have already covered the first point, And in a moment, the OSOR team will tell you about our current work on updating the guidelines on public procurement of open source software. Then Johan Linåker will talk about the development and acquisition of open source software in the public sector from a research perspective, and will present the case of Swedish public organizations, comparing it with other countries' practices. Next, Rasmus Frey will show us how Danish municipalities, with the support of OS2, manage the procurement of open source software. His presentation will be followed by Patrice-Emmanuel Schmitz talk about legal aspects of open source procurement, especially licensing. He will also present some practical tools that help with choosing a license for open source project or checking license compatibility with other licenses. There will be a bit of time after each presentation for questions. And at the end of the webinar, some additional time for discussion. And of course, you can also write your questions in the chat. So now you can match the presentation topics with the speakers' faces. Again, a warm welcome to our speakers. But first, to set a backdrop for their presentations, Chloe and Vivienne, could you please briefly talk about the guidelines?
Yes, Monica, thank you for the introduction. And thank you all for joining this morning for this webinar on public procurement. I am Chloé Dussoutour, part of the OSOR team, and we would like to give you some information on the upcoming updated version of these guidelines on public procurement of open source software. This is an updated version, as actually the first version of the guidelines was published in 2010 by some original authors, as we actually, some of them are in the call today. So we have Risha Bayarkosh, Rudiger Glott, Patrice-Emmanuel Schmitz, who is with us today, and Abdelkim Bouhaf. And so since then, as I just explained, it was 10 years ago. So since then, a new EU directive on public procurement was adopted. And of course, the state of play of the use of open source software by public administrations in the EU has changed. Therefore, the OSOR team, which also includes our colleagues from Open Forum Europe, is currently updating the document to provide up-to-date guidance and information to public administrations willing to procure open source solutions. So without further ado, I will jump into the objectives of the guidelines, which are threefold. The first objective is to provide useful information to public administration on the processes, principles, and requirements of the public procurement of OSS. We also aim at addressing the challenges of the public procurement of OSS by public administrations. And then, of course, we want to showcase the good practices of public procurement throughout the EU, and therefore we have elaborated some case studies of several EU countries and analyzed good practices from across all member states. So in the next slides, you see that so among the objectives of the guidelines for the public procurement of open source software, there is the provision of information on the policy and legislative framework underlying public procurement processes. And so in this updated version of the guidelines, we explore in detail this policy and legislative framework. Although at present there is no specific EU-wide legislation regarding the public procurement of open source software. However, we observe a general shift in favor of open source and openness as a whole when approaching digital government services. So in the in these guidelines, we analyzed all the policy and legislation pieces that are applicable to the procurement of OSS. Among those texts, the most prominent ones are, of course, the Directive 2014 24 EU on public procurement, which lays down the principles that procurement processes should abide by. So equal treatment, non-discrimination, mutual recognition, proportionality, transparency, and importantly, open competition, of course. And of course, these principles are also need to apply, of course. And we can see an example of this application in the sense that this directive also forbids public procurers to refer to a specific make or source unless justified, of course, by the subject matter of the contract. And even if the technical specification of a tender needs to make a reference to a specific solution, it should be accompanied by the mention or equivalent. So this is something to keep in mind in our public procurement processes where open source software is involved, that we need to ensure that the competition is indeed open. Another piece of legislation that is very important is the Regulation 1025 on European standardization, which outlines the importance of technical specifications based on open standards, where public procurement processes are built around it, and the use of open source standards would allow for more competition while reducing the risk of vendor lock-in. Last but not least, we also have the Talin and Berlin declarations. So the Talin Declaration especially promotes the open by default approach, as well as the use of open source solutions and open source standards when rebuilding ICT systems and solutions. And in the Berlin Declaration, once again, it's a political commitment from the member states that call for the use of common standards, modular architectures, and open source software in the public sector, especially when it comes to cross-border digital solutions. And one last policy initiative that we wanted to tell you about is the European Commission Open Source Software Strategy, Think Open. It is an internal document that the EC hopes that it will inspire other public administration across the EU. In this internal strategy, the European Commission is connected into reinforcing its open working culture, and this strategy also includes recommendation regarding the improvement of procurement processes in favor of open source software in order to continue leveling the playing field for the use of open source within the organization. This Think Open strategy is also the occasion to set up the Open Source Program Office, the OSPO of the European Commission, which provides assistance on procurement management, license issues, and actions regarding communities. All right, and then another important part of the guidelines is also the updated analysis of the state of play regarding the political and legal framework at national level. So we have seen that in 17 EU member states, there are political and or legislative initiatives that promote or mention the public procurement of open source software specifically. Now, I will not go into the detail of each one of those because this is what the guidelines are for. But we can already tell you that we could regroup all of these political and legislative initiatives into 3 overarching objectives. First one being to foster an OSS culture within the public sector. Second being ensuring a level playing field between proprietary and open source software providers. And last, pursuing internal strategies in favor of open source software. And I will now leave the floor to my colleague Vivian, who will tell you more about how do these policies and guidelines can be applied in practice.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Chloe. So indeed, the practical parts of the updated guidelines are built around 4 main steps of a typical public procurement process. And so the first one is all about the planning. So the step includes identifying the requirements, creating the procurement planning, carrying out the market research, and finally deciding according to the needs whether the software can be downloaded from a trusted online repository or whether it should go through a purchase through procurement. Then, if the software is going to be procured by the public administration, the next step concerns preparing the tender documentation itself. So though in some countries, as we just saw, there exists policy or legal guidelines on how to procure open source software, in others it may be still a question mark on how to ensure a level playing field between proprietary and open source software. And then particularly, sorry, I can hear someone else.
Vivian, we can't hear you anymore.
Sorry, I think, yeah, someone else was speaking. Yeah. Okay, so I think I was cut off in the part where, in this phase, during which the public buyer outlines the principles of public procurement, also the open standards and the legal basis on which the tender is based. Then there is also the consideration for the functional, technical, and the security requirements, as well as additional elements that the ICT product could offer, so the software in the end. So, for example, community support and specific business models. And preparing the tender documentation and specifications should ideally be done in collaboration with all the relevant stakeholders. Then the third step is the evaluation and the award to the most fitting proposal. So it includes for the public administration to select the software and the related service to it. So the evaluation is usually based on multiple criteria, such as the price, how the software will be maintained, is the licensing compatible with the public sector needs, what are the ownership specifications for the software and its components, and whether the security requirements are met, particularly for the public sector needs, and so forth. So these are just indeed typical criteria, but these can, of course, vary per country and even perhaps per public administration within a country. And then finally, once the contract is awarded, it should, of course, be managed. So in this step, for the contractual requirements, for example, interoperability, accessibility, code, and so forth, must be discussed before signing a contract and kicking off the activities. So for instance, modifications, support, updates, and other activities, they may be done both in-house and by the private sector vendors. And though contractually different points may be defined, in reality, there may be compromises to be made by the public administrations. So there should be some expectations for to make compromises. So thank you very much. That concludes our guidelines. So please keep an eye out for their publication expected in the summer. They will be published on OSOR in our Knowledge Center. And without further ado, I will let Monica introduce our guest speaker, Johan.
So before I do it, I actually wanted to thank you, Johan, for pointing out that in our presentation, Strasbourg Declaration was missing, adopted not long ago on the 25th of February, called Key to Success. And actually, this is a very important declaration and refers very strongly to the importance of open source use within public administration. So the reason for that is that the presentation and the webinar started to be prepared actually before the declaration was signed. So our omission, sorry for that, and thank you for pointing it out. And of course, what we presented today, it's not all when it comes to guidelines, because as the name suggests, it will be a big part guiding, hopefully, public administrations how to deal with public procurement and including open source in the procurement. So we talk about public sector requirements, functional, technical, legal, security requirements, and community requirements, which are very important when it comes to open source projects. And we also touch upon business model requirements. And that's all from two angles, theoretical and practical. So practical means how to deal with downloading and purchasing the open source. We also included in the guidelines 3 case studies, how it is done in Estonia, Italy, and France. So we hope that guidelines will be published in June. So you are encouraged to follow us on OSOR and read the guidelines, of course, and use them and provide feedback on them. So now it's time for our first guest to share with us his highlights on the open source in public procurement. And as promised at the beginning, let me introduce him properly. Johan Linåker is a postdoctoral researcher at Sweden's Lund University with a focus on how to enable the public sector to share and collaborate on open source software and open data. Johan holds a passion for health and sustainability of open source software projects, researching challenges experienced both by maintainers and public sector, and how those challenges may be addressed. He's also a founder of OpenHug C4H, which is OpenHug Coding for Humanity, a social company and collaborative community driving open source solutions to pressing societal and humanitarian challenges. It is not the first time Johan is with us to share his insight. And a year ago, he was speaking about the health and the sustainability of open source being essential to a secure and robust digital infrastructure. But of course, today's focus is on open procurement practices. Johan, our virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. I will try to present my screen. Okay, so that was a bit, and I think that was the bio. I probably should have updated it, but currently I'm a senior researcher at the RISE Research Institute of Sweden, but yeah, still doing the same things and with the same passion as always. So I'm going to talk about acquisition and development of open source software in the public sector, or how public sector organizations can reuse and develop open source and use the public procurement frameworks as their main tool. And just to give you some context, in Sweden, we don't have as explicit guidelines, for example, or frameworks, legal frameworks, as in Italy and France and Estonia, aligning with the case studies Monica mentioned. We have a lot more softer and implicit guidelines For example, the one usually referred to is the one by the Swedish e-delegation from 2012, I think, that urges public administrations to, as far as possible, use open standards and open source software to avoid lock-in and so on. We also have from the Swedish Insurance Agency, which is one of the more progressive agencies in Sweden in terms of open source, saying that open source should always be considered, pending that it fulfills the requirement spec, and also that the total cost of ownership is reasonable in comparison with the options.
Johan, would it be possible for you to put in full screen?
Are you seeing my?
Move on.
Are you seeing the presentation or the?
Yeah, we see the whole thing, like the.
Okay. I don't know. That was the.
Perhaps in display setting.
Is that there?
Ah, super, perfect. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Sorry for that. Always something. Yeah, so I think I was saying that looking at the Swedish Agency for Digital Government, DIG, in their guidelines, they say that software that is developed or acquired should in the first time be published as open source software. So we have these different guidelines, quite implicit. They provide some kind of finger direction, but I think we need some more, but at least we have some good frameworks that are pointing in a good direction. And also we have some tools and support like the Swedish the Swedish Legal, Finance and Administrative Service Agency, Kammarkollegiet, for example, have requirements that you could use in tenders, for example, in terms of when specifying that you want to use a specific open source software component. But there needs to be more support, and I think this is where the work that I'm presenting today, which is I've collaborated together with a lot of procurement specialists and developed these through the later time period, and that we're still working on. But hopefully this will provide one piece of the puzzle to the larger puzzle, so to say. And I think what I'm going to present now complements quite well with the OSOR work. So starting off, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
I think it froze. No? Okay, can I do it like this? Okay, sorry. Presentation first. So first I'm going to talk about the reuse of existing open source software. And the first question that needs to be asked, that is quite often not asked, is are there any open alternatives out there? And reason being that a lot of people that I talk to, they're not aware of open source, or they have different preconceptions or different understandings of open source, and don't know where to look. But there are a lot of resources, a lot of national specific software catalogs have popped up during the recent years, like in France, Italy have very mature catalogs. We are developing now in the Swedish context of open source software that is developed and used by different public administrations. You can also reach out to the different networks and use requests for informations or RFIs and talk to vendors to identify the different alternatives. And another good thing with open source is that you can download, test, and cross-check against your pre-specified requirement specification, but you can also use this testing to develop your requirement spec even further. And then you can also ask, are these missing requirements critical, or can they be developed to a reasonable cost? So it may often be that maybe you have something that works to 80 or 90%, but then these last 20 to 10%, it may be that you can actually develop these from scratch and potentially upstream to an existing project to have it maintained by that community. The next step to ask is what I talked about last time, is the project health, or how secure and sustainable is the open source software? How well maintained is it? To what quality levels? What's the risk of interruptions? How does the maintenance structure and the community look that maintains the software? Do we need to procure support from a supplier in order to trust the security and the service level, or maybe a package solution? And there are different checklists out there, like in the chaos community. Red Hat has one good list as well, and we're currently having a research project where we are developing new guidelines for this in the Swedish context. The next step is to ask, what can you do yourself and what do you need help with? So do we need to procure services, for example, in terms of training, hosting it, customizing it to our specific needs, building integration to the solution X and Y? Or can we adopt this enterprise package solutions that maybe takes these different things and puts it together? So this is currently what one group of authorities or agencies in Sweden are looking into, what kinds of communication and collaboration tools can be used to replace existing more complete solutions like Teams and Skype. And they are leaning towards like having different pieces of the puzzles, like one component for chat, one for video, one for document sharing and so on, and seeing how these can be integrated to provide one big solution. And then there's the question, okay, how can we fulfill these needs? Can we use the existing frameworks, or do we need to do a new procurement? Or do we have the capacity, but we just need to help with the internal training to evolve our capacity in terms of managing this open source software? Then maybe we can do it with the direct procurement up towards the boundary limits. And then it's about dividing the customizations. Are you seeing the main screen now, or are you seeing the notes screen?
Still the notes.
Oh, sorry for that. I'm watching the other.
Perfect, thanks a lot.
Sorry for that. So another part is, okay, what parts can we maybe divide this big thing into smaller pieces, which is something that I'm going to talk about later. Next question is, okay, so what do you actually expect to gain from using the open source software? So there can be multiple aspects, but you need to be sure of what kind of value you expect to get out of it. And this is just a long list. I won't go into all the things, but basically you need to know what value you expect, because that affects how you should plan your acquisition and what services you should procure and in what ways, for example. I mean, if it's enough for the more general perspective of public money, public code, then maybe and transparency, then maybe it's enough that the code is published with an open source license. Whilst if you're expecting reduced maintenance costs and so on, then you really need to be sure that there are other public administrations, for example, or other members, actors in the community that actually take part in the collaboration. Then we can talk about the qualification requirements on suppliers. So the Swedish insurance agency, for example, in terms of enterprise package solutions, they prefer ones that has a community-first approach, meaning that all new features are upstreamed to an open source, to the open source software project, and not kept as an enterprise add-on, like in the open core business model. It's also beneficial that the supplier can show a track record of being involved, having experience in open source, but especially in the open source software project at hand. Preferably, this should be a recent experience and stretch over a longer period of time. And it can be checked and validated, for example, through accepted code contributions and how active they've been in the technical discussions. Extra qualifying is if they possess some kind of seat at the table or have a good position in the governance structure within the open source software project, so that there is at least a higher level of guarantee that any changes or newly developments that you do can be upstreamed to the open source software project, which should be a general requirement in order to guarantee a lot of the benefits that can be gained. Then it's about weighing the different alternatives. So we have, in this case, so this table is a simplification of a pre-study from the Swedish Governmental Service Center, who did looked into different e-archival solutions. So they looked into one proprietary option, one open source community edition option, and one open source enterprise option. And they looked at the procurement, security, cost, organization, and technical requirements, and tried to evaluate and weigh these different options together. This is not complete, and I would rather recommend looking at the case of Italy, that has a lot more explicit frameworks for how you should consider open source, as I mentioned in the beginning. And as a consequence of this, they also have a joint decision model, how to rank open source software, but also helps comparing different open alternatives with proprietary ones. And this model picks up on technical aspects such as requirement fulfillment, interoperability, security, project health, as I was talking about, but also the economical aspects, total cost of ownership, which is very important, looking into installation, integrations, hosting, training, and so on. So I really recommend to have a look at those guidelines. Then looking at the second part, development of new open source software. So it may be that there are certain open source software components that you can reuse, but some parts you need to develop from scratch, or maybe the full thing, which you are considering in the acquisition. Here, the first part you really need to look into, what are you expecting to gain out of it? Is it really worth developing from scratch? Because there are a lot of costs and risks connected to this, and this is also in industry. There needs to be a strong business case if you want to develop something from scratch, because building a community is a risky endeavor. There's no guarantee that you will actually get the kickback business-wise by and then getting others to join the project. So this is one reason why you really have to be on the lookout for other stakeholders, other ones sharing the same vision or problem as yourself, and initiating this open collaboration from the start. So these are some questions that you need to ask yourself and answer. For example, should the development be carried out internally or through acquired supply resources? In the latter case, how should the ownership of the copyright be managed? Long-term maintenance and management, and so on. And I think all of these questions are things that Rasmus will give a lot of good answers to, I think, in the next presentation. Otherwise, ask him. But the main thing here...
Johan, apologies for jumping in. There are 5 minutes left, just for you to be aware of the time.
Oh, okay.
Thanks a lot.
So the main important thing here, be open from the start. Meaning that define that it should be coded online on GitHub, for example, with an open source license, and include all of the necessary documentation so that it's not locked in. In other words, be sure that it's developed as open source from scratch. And here's a more overarching thing. It's about bridging this sequential way of working in procurement, which is typically a one-way process, with a more general practice in software industry that you develop something more agile, one feature at a time. So the main question here, how can you bridge these two worlds? So in a very extreme way, you can look at it as a public administration working in the product cycle. They have an idea, they start a project, they enter the procurement cycle, do a pre-study, enter the procurement phase, then the realization phase, and then one supplier gets the whole tender and then develops it. And then something is delivered 4 or 5 years later. What we want to do is move to something like this, where administrations can work together in the product cycle, perform multiple procurement cycles of even more development cycles, where the contract is not exclusive for one supplier, that is actually shared among multiple suppliers. One way of doing this could be to consider dynamic purchasing systems as a procurement form, which basically enables suppliers to join dynamically if they meet the basic requirements. And in theory, it could enable a model where you procure through pull requests, basically. So a ticket could be a tender and a pull request could be a solution proposal. But there are a lot of challenges here in terms of tool support, but also culture, processes, and so on. And there is a need for collaboration and coordination, as I mentioned. There's the ASPO, more centralized model, as in Italy, the foundation model that Rasmus is going to speak about, at the network level, where in Sweden, where agencies are collaborating more on a more informal level. Another thing that open source enables is the follow-up, that you can continuously monitor and monitor the planning and development, but also engage as a product owner in a much more active way than what you could in a more proprietary setting. It also allows you to review quality and security aspects as the work progresses. And one last thing here I'd like to highlight is that public agencies should not just consider open source on each procurement isolated. There should be some kind of overall general strategy, like in many mature companies today, on how you consider open source. This enables synergies between projects, that you can collaborate, set up more process between operations, the architects, the product owners, and the procurement office. Common governance models and so on. Highlighting a lot of need for training and culture and resources that I've seen, at least in Sweden, but that we are progressing over, like defining a catalog of open source, helping agencies to find what software is available, defining processes for procurement planning for how you can consider open source, identifying real-world examples and case studies, as OSOR has done now, creating cost and risk evaluation models like the one in Italy, example requirements, evaluation models for open source software products, for example, is in terms of health, and also in terms of suppliers, and also ways in how both administrations can work and collaborate together, but also with the suppliers in an open community, so to say. So then I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. I think bringing in, let's say, the insights or the perspective of a researcher, it's a critical point. Maybe I will just address the question within the chat. There are a couple of them. I will start with the first one. Are there any contracting legal guidelines for product aspect as warranty or compensation?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Yep. Are there any contracting legal guidelines for product aspects as warranty and compensation?
Contracting requirements, or what did you say?
Maybe we can ask Michael to clarify this aspect.
Yes, I think in a software contract, it's very important to have the legal regulations stated, as in non-open software. So one thing is warranty, what will happen if the product fails, if it doesn't function right, if it makes damages. So what are there any guidelines for this, for a legal contract?
So in that sense, I mean, open source is use as is. You can't put any requirements on the community developing it. If you want that security, or if you want to have a service level agreement, then you need to contract somebody, and then you have the I would say the more standard legal frameworks and procurement frameworks that can be used for these suppliers. And I think in Sweden there are, I don't know in detail, but as I said in the beginning, the Kammarkollegiet, the Swedish Finance, Legal and Administrative Service Agency in Sweden, they have a set of requirements created a couple of years ago by Donny Melin and others that maybe some of you know, that provide example requirements that agencies or those doing the procurement can put into the tender that helps, for example, state that all everything developed should be upstreamed to the main original project.
Thank you.
I think you're muted, Federico.
Yes, apologies for that. Thanks a lot, and then I will move on to the next question. So, how can a software project like LibreOffice or Ubuntu prove that it has reached the necessary level of maturity?
I think through cases and good examples. I mean, in both cases, LibreOffice and Ubuntu, there are a lot of examples of those using it. But again, as I've noticed in the Swedish context, agencies they want examples of others who are using it. For example, I worked a long time together with the Swedish Public Employment Service, and we've put into this open source catalog that they are using Jitsi, for example, or Mattermost, and then others agencies are looking. Oh, the employment service, they have an IT organization of 600 and are one of the largest ones in Sweden. If they are using Jitsi and Mattermost, then there must be something into this, and then they are 2 calls away, and they can talk to the technical product owner at the employment service and get their more personal input. So I think networking and showcasing of examples and who are using it, and that really helps. So I think by using these software catalogs and showing who are actually using the software, that can really help to progress the adoption.
Thanks a lot, and then I will maybe ask if Philip wants to add any on that, because he was mentioning that there is, let's say, a market readiness level to support the evaluation of maturity of solutions. No, I was if Philip wants to complement, because it was mentioning that there is a market readiness level basically to evaluate the maturity of solutions, if he wants to share any additional insights. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
I mean, I can just add that in Sweden we are initializing what we could call a test and demonstration environment, where we want to provide an environment for municipalities and agencies in order to test open source software. Because I mentioned at the beginning, one of the benefits with open source is that you can actually test and see how it works in practice and evaluate and so on. But a lot of, especially municipalities, they don't have these resources or the technical capabilities. So what we are developing here in Sweden from RISE is a test and demo environment that can actually enable this testing and provide these resources centrally.
Thanks a lot for the addition. I see that also Alessandro has a question with some context. I don't know if he wants to take the lead, otherwise I will address it.
Thank you. So my question relates to the readiness of regulation or governance framework, let's say, of open source procurement and complementary regulation. For example, in recent research, I got to know that there is a case in Estonia of an open source software that is being piloted. And the problem there was not the open source software per se, but the regulation on data privacy and open auditing to ensure data privacy. So my point is, I think, as in other cases, that there is a contrast between different fields and regulation in different fields. One maybe is ready, but the other one is not. And I was interested in understanding the opinion here and maybe what would be the solution if this is the case. Thank you.
So, meaning that it's open source doesn't solve other aspects. Open source adds transparency to the code and certain freedoms, or how we call it, through the license, and how you can use and share and remodify and redistribute and so on, and enables an open collaboration model where you can collaborate on the development and so on. So I mean, if the software doesn't fulfill needs, for example, in terms of how data is managed and so on, ideally this is something that you can address collaboratively or by your own, openly in this open development. So I think it's important not to mix up the different concepts here. I mean, data privacy, these are very important things, and I think this is one of the reasons why we are initiating this test environment in order to allow municipalities to test and see how different open solutions abide by their requirements, for example, in terms of data management and so on.
Thanks a lot. And one last question. Apologies, Nico, didn't want to skip it, just probably the chat was going on. So it says that it sees that a lot of software that is not procured and gets adopted by developers because it's trendy or convenient. So no formal decision is made. Is thinking of having a simple guideline to community. Any suggestion how to communicate guidelines to all employees? All employers, apologies.
So the question is that a lot of software is consumed outside of the being procured, so to say. So a lot of, and that's right, especially in the industrial setting or in the more places where you talk about the infrastructure or where you have larger IT departments. So most of the software is consumed directly by the developers. And again, here you need to have guidelines, for example, in terms of helping developers choose the right projects and evaluating the health of the project and so on. But I think that's a general issue that is not unique for the public sector. That this is a general consumption challenge where there are a lot of practices, best practices that can be adopted from industry right away, where you don't need to talk about the acquisition process. That I think is more. I think this more larger acquisition process that we are talking about now, it's more geared towards the larger applications and more critical software rather than the more minor packages and components or tools used on the more operational levels, where developers usually have more freedom.
And once again, thanks a lot. I think we'll have some more time at the end for additional Q&A, but just for the sake of respecting the timetable, let's move on to the next speaker, and for that I will leave the floor to Monica.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Federico. And thank you, Johan, very much for this very insightful presentation. And this leads us to the next presentation of Rasmus. Rasmus Frey is Chief Executive and the Head of Secretariat of OS2, Public Digitalization Network, an open source community that develops and governs IT solutions for municipalities in Denmark. He's passionate about openness and knowledge sharing, and these values he tries to reflect in, he actually reflects in his current work. And this passion brings excellent results. And as OS2 was initially launched with the collaboration of just 5 municipalities, and now it includes 98. He is not the first time with us today. He shared already his experience with the OSOR community in August 2021, and he was talking on building cross-administration collaboration on open source projects. Today, he will give a hands-on presentation on how Danish municipalities procure open source software. And I'm sure he very convincingly will describe why it is not complicated and not that different from purchasing proprietary software. So, Rasmus, over to you.
I hope everyone can hear me, and maybe you can also.
Yes.
Then I'll do my best in explaining why it's not that complicated.
It's definitely possible, maybe sometimes challenging, but your work in OS2 shows that it's really doable.
But first I need to share the right screen. And must be the PowerPoint slideshow, I guess. Yeah. I think you see that now?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Now I just need to be able to actually change the slide. Okay, so I've already been introduced. My name is Rasmus, and I am the Chief of Operations and Secretary in the Danish Association OS2. Which is basically an association for public authorities wishing to collaborate using open source as a model. In my talk, I will tell you a little bit about how OS2 approaches the procurement process of open source, primarily within Danish municipalities, because that's where most of our members are. I will put this in context to OS2's purpose and what it is that we do. And then I will also talk about the most important aspects when actually purchasing open source software, doing the actual procurement, and of course put this in context to some of the challenges that we need to address, or at least that we consider important to address. Yeah, well, we are an association. It's for public authorities only, state, municipality, and as Monica said, it was founded by 5 municipalities 10 years ago, and today we are nearly all 98 Danish municipalities. It's a small country, so we are only 98 in total, and of course we're just a small brick in the puzzle when it comes to digitizing Denmark as a nation. But if you ask me, then we're also one of the most important ones. And that's because we focus on that municipalities and other authorities, they shouldn't reinvent the wheel every time a new shared business need that needs to be solved pops up or is identified. So it makes sense to actually ensure that we get the most value for taxpayers' money when digitizing our services and our workplaces. So I think we have an important task or an important role in the entire landscape of digitizing. And of course, we don't do this because open source necessarily is the solution to all problems. I don't consider open source being a one-size-fits-all. There's definitely room for other solutions as well. But we do it because the Danish municipalities, they want the best implementation of technology that they can get. And because open source is a great means to actually achieve certain goals. I'm not going to go through all of them. We don't have time for that. But for example, it's important that it is not complexity that prevent us from changing or doing our own development or sharing our solutions. So therefore we have to build for reuse and we have to build for change. Open source is just a great means to do that. It's also important that we don't create vendor logins. We don't like being tied to one single vendor. We don't like that technology is the barrier to actually changing the vendor. So we need to prevent that using open source. And I think most of you in this call can probably agree that the things on the list here, open source can be a great driver to actually achieve these goals. So when we are given these opportunities that we can use to our advantage, then we also put ourselves in a different position than with traditional proprietary software in regards of procurement, but also in regards of what comes after. So we need to position ourselves so we can get the most out of these advantages that open source is giving us. So there's things that we must be aware of when we start considering buying open source development or open source standard software, because we no longer buy a piece of software off the shelf or a piece of software owned by a single company. We actually buy software that is maintained by a community, or we buy software that we ourselves become the maintainer of, which is mostly the case in OS2. We are actually the maintainers of the software that is created. So it's very important that we know with what to comply and when to comply. And we could have an entire talk about this subject, so we don't have time to dig in deeper, but there's always a playbook around an open source project, and it's important that you know how to comply with that, or it's important that you know how to create your own playbook. And things like contributing, how do you actually contribute back? And you need to consider, are you able to contribute, or to what degree are you able to contribute? You need to make sure that everyone work on the same project, the same code, and that the people involved are actually contributing in a meaningful way and add value to the project, but also to the community and to our own business. And this, of course, all starts with the procurement, getting ready to actually start using this piece of software, this digital solution. And that's why OS2 is here, because there is no need that Danish municipalities each become an expert. So it's better to have an organization that then can help each of these organizations. And you can compare OS2 to an OSPO, because essentially we are the open source program office for Danish municipalities. That's the easy comparison. It's the place where we make sure to gather knowledge about open source and where we maintain the governance framework needed for Danish public authorities to be able to actually procure, comply, contribute, and release within the open source model. So I've listed some challenges that we often experience from that public servants have when they start grooming their organization to look towards open source solutions. And some of them may sound banal, but this is what we meet. And procurement starts way early. And it's always because there is some kind of need that you need, some kind of challenge that you need to solve. So before we can start considering procuring for open source, we of course need to have our organization and our leadership on board. So most of the challenges that we have identified is actually related to that. And one of the easy things in an organization is always to say that this is not for me, it's not the right fit. not invented here. Someone else made that solution. We can't use it. And that's related to the culture. There is most organizations still have a certain biased opinion towards open source. You probably know these. And then there's always this thing about involvement, the community. How should I handle that? And it's just so important because it's part of the open source ecosystem. That's what makes the project sustainable, that there is actually involvement. So if we as municipalities choose open source, we need to be able to actually involve ourselves in the project. We suddenly become owners or maintainers of a source code that no one else is going to take care of if we don't. Another step is that you ask your legal department, can we do this? And many have experienced getting a no. You will be told that we can't buy open source, that's not within the law, or that we can't release this thing that you have paid someone to code because we've made it for ourselves, and as a public authority, we're not allowed to release it. That's of course not true, but that's the answer that people get. And the last challenge is when procuring open source software, there is some alternative or some additional requirements, what I call non-functional requirements, that you need to be able to put in your procurement process so the vendors, the providers can actually live up to them. I will get back to it later, but that's definitely a challenge because organizations are not used to having to add these. So we've created this central place for knowledge about open source, and our primary focus is lowering the barriers when it comes to the before mentioned challenges. And then it is to establish the governance around these local implementations of open source software and make sure that we have sustainable collaborations both within the Danish sector, but also if it's another open source project, our small community must have a sustainable relationship with the main community. So that's our purpose. One of the first thing that we do, and I think this is probably the most important one because this is what's actually making sure that open source procurement happens. We need to do a lot of communication. We have to tell people about open source all the time. We have to make sure that those myths disappear, or at least that they're challenged. And we have to put a bit of pressure on the culture in various organizations so they become more biased towards actually accepting open source as a solution in their procurement process. So that's why I've also brought it here as part of our process, because open source procurement won't happen if we don't tell those stories over and over again. And of course, the OSOR, the join up community is also great at this. So we're getting there. And then we have to make sure that we have the necessary documentation to get legal on our side in choosing open source. So we have what we call the open source note. And that is a document that we've asked Kammeradvokaten, Danish word, that's the primary attorneys to the Danish state. So they've created this open source node on behalf of OS2. And first of all, it concludes that that what we are doing is actually within the law. This is okay. And then secondly, any legal worker that is actually presented to this open source node should become aware that there is something here that they might not know and need to study. And then they should be more open to saying yes instead of just the automatic reply. So part of this is also the decision tree, a few simple questions related to the Danish law to begin with. And that is to actually conclude if the project you're about to begin can be solved within the OS2 framework. And in most cases, it will end up with the box, welcome to OS2. Then we move on to the larger decision tree, and that's to conclude how the fit is with our governance model. And also to conclude, is it even possible to do this with open source, or to actually make the solution open source afterwards. And of course, a few times you end up in one of the red boxes saying that, sorry, OS2 is not for this project. And often it has to do with that we are not trying to solve a problem that is shared or common, or that you already are biased towards a solution that is not open source or can't be made open source. But it's an important tool to make sure that you get started in the right way, and that you, first of all, are within the law. Because if you haven't made that sure of that, then you won't get far in your procurement. And the next step is that it must be possible to get help from professionals, because at least in Denmark, the Danish municipality don't have technical staff on at least not many. So we can't implement, we can't develop, or we can't host and support these systems ourselves. We buy that from professionals. And in OS2, we have already a list of private IT companies that have signed our partner agreement, meaning that they are willing and able to hand over all results created within this partnership. Hence, they are able to open source it. And this is important because we have already pre-screened. So we already know a long list of vendors that are actually able to release results as open source, and that are actually able to comply with the code of conduct that we have within OS2. The last tool that we use, of course, well, this is a compact version. There's more guides in OS2, but the last tool is related to the non-functional requirements, and it's an important part of any procurement process. But in our case, we have some extra ones because we want to work within the open source model. And it could, for instance, be something like, how will you require that the vendor contribute back to the project? And you probably also need to ask them, how are they going to comply with the open source license? Do they even know what it is? What is their process for handling security updates to the central project? How are we going to handle contributions from other members of the community? Things like that is what we put in within the framework of non-functional requirements. And we have a project that is called OS2 Kravmotor, another Danish word, and in English it directly translates to a requirements engine. And it's a solution that will guide you through a set of questions to determine what kind of project you are about to purchase. And in the end, you will be presented with a list of recommended non-functional requirements that you, at least the system thinks you should use. This solution can be used to procure any software, basically, because it's basically just a database and some questions that are fully configurable. But we use it as a tool to make sure that we don't forget, and to make sure that the requirements that we present to the private companies helping us are always formulated in the same way over time, so they also know how to actually answer them and how to comply with them. So, and a very important tool in our procurement process. And I'm starting to run out of time. I can see. Another thing is to actually evaluate the quality of this open source project, or set the bar for your own project. Because just because it's open source, it doesn't mean it's great, or it doesn't mean that it's sustainable or long-lasting or anything. And in the end, it all comes down to the community, basically. We have what we call our governance report, and we group projects into 3 levels, 1, 2, 3. Well, level 3 is the one with the most requirements, and it's basically just a simple checklist, again, with questions that force you to think about how certain things are addressed in the project, or how you want them to be addressed if you're the one doing the new open source project. Then we also need a community, because there needs to be someone in charge, there needs to be someone driving the project. Of course, if it's an existing open source project, there's probably already a community. If there's not, then run away or make sure that it happens. But we always group the organizations within our membership base that are interested in this project needs to be the drivers of the projects. So we create a formal organization or a sub-community around each project. And the community is one of the most important parts of any open source project, because without it, nothing is going to happen. So we see this as a critical part of the entire procurement process, that we're actually able to get the users on board, but also the vendor or multiple vendors as part of this sub-community. Yeah. I'm going to skip this one quickly. You'll get it afterwards. You need a good framework. I definitely recommend the countries or the regions or that don't have an organization similar to OS2 or don't have an OSPO. Start looking into how can we get this central place where we can make things happen. Time for questions.
Thanks a lot, Rasmus, and thanks a lot for bringing the Danish experience directly to us. I will start with a question that sparkled from the comments within the chat. Does OS2 perform regular audits to ensure compliance with GDPR or in general, let's say, with other legislation?
Yes and no. We do that within each project. We don't do it as a general thing where we evaluate the open source project, but when we have a community and a group of users, then that group will evaluate the quality and they will of course evaluate what kind of contract do you need with the vendor and how does it fulfill with regulation. But it's of course also part of the governance report that you need to look into this as part of the actually buying the software or buying the service. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I see Yanis asking for the floor if he wants to go ahead, and then we'll address the question in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I have a question. You mentioned, and I agree with you totally, that the community is like the basic stone of everything, because without the community, nothing happens. Could you share, or do you have some best practices how the community, which is building the open source solution, interacts with the community building the project? I mean, in the situation where you use several open source projects as a starting point and then build a solution on top of that. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure that we have a best practice for collaborating with existing open source projects. Well, we have a single project in OS2 that is collaborating with I think it's called Pretix, some ticketing system where there is active coordinating and dialogue between the main community and then the smaller community here in Denmark. But most of the time, well, 9.9 out of 10 times, what is within OS2 is something that we actually develop ourselves, or that we pay someone to develop for us. So it's new projects that we create.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
And what we make sure is that there is money available to pay people. Because, well, both in our own organization, if everything happens on a volunteer basis, then it's going to be very, very slow, or it's going to die out. And we also need to make sure that if we have built something that is based on another project, then one of the ways we can contribute is by actually donating money back to that project, making sure that the people working on it have the ability to get paid to do it.
Yeah, thank you again. And yeah, this is very important that you are contributing also money-wise, or yeah, thank you.
We could always do more, but yeah.
Thanks a lot, Rasmus. I will jump on to the next question from Marco, asking if did you develop any strategy about migration to cloud computing?
No, we don't have a defined strategy on that. That happens again on a project level. If it makes sense, then they will do it as part of their strategy within the sub-community around each product. And for some of the solutions, it makes sense to keep it as local environments, and for others, for instance, the demand or the requirements engine, that is run as a cloud service, or as a software as a service running in the cloud, because it's a single solution, and it doesn't make sense to have multiple of those. So all municipalities that are a member can connect to that solution. But we don't have any grand strategy about that. We tried a few years ago establishing what we call the OS2 cloud. And the idea was to make all of the products and projects available within that framework. But I don't think the world was ready for it, to be honest. We're still trying to solve how we can use Microsoft as our provider here in Denmark.
Then I will leave the floor maybe to Gerardo if he wants to provide a bit of context related to his question. Otherwise, I will address it myself.
Hello.
Hello.
What I was addressing was basically, here in Portugal, we have been following the initiatives from the OS2, the OW2, from the Good Government Initiative, and some of the to-do guides, which seem to have some parallels with your approaches. So our question is more about if you have been following those initiatives, and if they have some mapping between your own approaches, because they have also a good checklist, a good way to guide all these processes.
To be honest, we do too little of this. Well, it probably all comes down to available resources. We of course look at what happens in other places and try to take the best from that and implement it here locally, but we don't participate in any international level networks. Well, I have been given the task to solve this for the Danish public sector, primarily the Danish municipalities. I would wish that we, for instance, had a European level association similar to all these other organizations that were our go-to place where we could share knowledge. I think that currently there's many smaller organizations in various countries, and some are also working across country borders. But to me, at least, it's hard to get an overview of where to look and when to look. And in my small secretary, we are 2 people. We don't have the time to look outside of Denmark, basically. We focus on getting the best of it within the borders of Denmark, to be honest. Yeah. So no, unfortunately.
So I see that there are a few more questions in the chat, but we are running out of time. Maybe Rasmus, may I kindly ask you to address them in the chat while we move on with the next presentation, in case at the end, if we still have time, we will have more time to discuss further.
Of course, I will, and people are always welcome to reach out to me. My email is in the slides you get afterwards. So thank you.
So indeed, we may be not running out of time, but and we might have some time at the end of the next presentation to address all the questions. But in the meantime, if you could continue the discussion in the chat, that would be very useful for our participants. And big thank to you for all the practical tips, such as, for example, having a tool as Krav Motor. I think it really contributes to the consistency and transparency in the procurement process. And the same for having a clearly established decision tree, which I would really appreciate to have in English, and I guess some of our participants too, so maybe one day you could share it in English, because machine translation is not that reliable. I tried and it didn't work that great. Anyway, I hope that all those practical tips will inspire other public organizations to have similar tools. So once again, thank you very much. And now let me introduce our third speaker, Patrice-Emmanuel Schmitz, a lawyer specializing in open source licensing. He's been cooperating with the European Commission for many years as legal expert for JoinUp collaborative platform. He manages the community on JoinUp that focuses on licensing issues, and especially the European public license. Actually, he was very deeply involved in the work on the EUPL, both its first version and the current version, the EUPL version 1.2. He's also an author of the EUPL guidelines that the Commission published not long ago, and he's behind creation of very practical and user-friendly tools that can help with choosing a license for open source projects or checking license compatibility with other licenses. They are, of course, available on JoinUp. So, Patrice, let's now dive into the legal perspective of the open source. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
So, I will not repeat too much what other speakers have said already. So I will be quite fast on the first slide, but first we should open the screen with the slides, Federico or Chloe, because currently I don't see anything.
We'll be sharing in a second.
Yeah.
It's on. Normally you can see it now.
Okay, thank you. So, as you may know, I'm working for JoinUp in the legal support, and we will not repeat what others have said, but it's for sure that the public sector needs are about transparency, sustainability, cost effectiveness, and this presupposes an equal treatment of all solutions, of all, let's say, contractor or service provider, non-discrimination, transparency, and looking the best value for money. So we can go to the next slide. Voila. So, of course, we are about, we speak about open source, and we all know the fundamental of open source, meaning the rights, and finally, the rights are always the same. It's to use the software for any purpose, study, modify, improve, and distribute. But all that is finally providing from a license. And that's very important because the license is a legal document. Some say it's a contract, and I think it's a contract. It's not a contract that both parties are signing, but it's a contract that you commit yourself by the simple fact that you use the software, supposing that the licensing conditions are well known and indicated in the source and in the documentation. That's important it's important to know that if the rights are about the same for all open source license, because open source means also that the license is officially open source. Open source is a trademark. It's a trademark of the OSI, Open Source Initiative Organization. You have also the Free Software Foundation, which has adopted another definition of open source, which is free software, and the two definitions are mostly equivalent. But if the rights are always the same, the condition implemented by the various license could be very, very different. And that's important to know that. So far, we have not spoken too much about licensing, but now it's time to do it, because licensing has an important impact in the case of redistribution. And I think we cannot differentiate procurement from redistribution, because if you want to share and to reuse software across many users, many municipalities or many countries, you cannot dissociate the two-step procurement and sharing or redistribution. It's finally two steps in the same cyclic process. And when redistributing, you have to consider the interoperability first. I will define it later. The compatibility between various components obtained under various license, and also the reciprocity, meaning the guarantee that the public sector assets will be protected long term in a way that the distributed derivative will stay open and and that you as licensor and all the other members of a community will benefit from the later improvement. Okay. So we know the basic legal framework, mainly the directive, the Directive 2014, requesting equal treatment and no use of brand except unless, let's say, justified by the contract, and opening the way to equivalent solution. So we can continue and explore why open source fits public procurement. We know we already spoken about transparency, because you know what is it happening with the code, because you have access to the code. But it's important to focus on interoperability too, because this is sometimes depending of the license that you are using. Interoperability means the possibility to link or to integrate, to combine various components without condition that will restrict this interoperability. For example, condition related to a viral character of the license, other conditions that may impact interoperability. And all that together help to construct sustainable solution and ensure independence, so no vendor locking, and flexibility, being able to change vendor, to change service provider, to bring a new supplier to the procurement. Thanks. Regarding the European Commission itself, we have, of course, the European Interoperability Framework, which contains mostly recommendation. It is not binding, but there are recommendations related to procurement to ensure fair consideration using open source software, and also recommendation on the other part of the cycle, which is sharing and reuse. And in that field, you have more than a recommendation, you have a decision which has been taken recently in December 2021, that the Commission may choose to make software available for reuse, but in case this decision is taken, the open source license shall be the UPL, the European Union Public License, with possible exception due to third-party obligation or copyleft provision if you receive the component under, for example, the GPL or the AGPL, you have the obligation to reuse this license or when you distribute a derivative. But in all other cases, it will be the UPL. And in consideration of the difficulty of licensing, you can. In consideration to the difficulty of licensing, JoinUp has developed a licensing assistant tool with two main functions. A first function is to find and compare license, and a second function about checking their compatibility. So the first function is based on the license content. And not only what you can do, because the rights, as I said already, are basically the same, the right to reproduce, to distribute, to modify, to use patent, not in all cases, and so on, to sublicense, but not in all cases also. But there are other aspects of the license, what you must do, and on this point, the licenses are very different, what you cannot do possibly, and how far the license is compatible with other, which law is applicable. In some cases, there are explicit reference to the law of the USA. In some cases, it's a general reference to the licensor law or to the European law. And the support you can receive, first, the fact the main leading organization like the Open Source Initiative or the Free Software Foundation consider that the license is free or is open, and also the fact that an important community of users or possibly the European Union itself or a government are supporting the license.
Patrice, sorry for interrupting. You have 2 minutes left just to ensure enough time also for the Q&A afterwards.
Okay. Okay. Then I will go to the next function. The compatibility checker. This is also an important function. What is compatibility finally? Compatibility, it is the possibility to merge code obtained under various license and to distribute the result to third party. And this is sometimes a nightmare if you consider the real question of the join-up user. So we have implemented a small compatibility checker when you can select the inbound license, so the license of the component you receive, and the outbound license, meaning the license that you want to use for redistributing the result. And then you have a small analysis of the tool. The tool is to improve, but it is already working and implemented. So we will terminate by some slide about the option that you you have, it's to use off-the-shelf software or let's progress a little bit quicker in the next slide. Okay, off the shelf, I must report that some country, and I take just one of the case, it is France, that have implemented a kind of catalog, a kind of portfolio of free software that you can use that are recommended. And I think I experimented the fact that municipalities and public collectivities are more or less following the catalog, but the catalog is still a recommendation. And also there is a limitation of the license you may use for distribution, but indirectly it has also an impact of procurement, of course. It's some permissive license, MIT, BSD, Apache, and some reciprocal license, UPL, CECIL, and the GPL family, and the EPL also. Voilà. Last remark about custom build software, and what we can do for custom build software is to think about licensing immediately, because when you say custom build, it's quite rare that you don't reuse also existing component. And there is a specific approach also. Next slide. When you use free downloading, because is free downloading procurement? I think there was one of the question of the participant about that. I think it is not procurement, of course, when you download software free of charge, but it can be a step in a broader service procurement process. So downloading free of charge, it's good to test the functionality, to test also the legal impact of licensing, the compatibility, and to make an evaluation, and to test also the support you can obtain, the maturity of the tool. But finally, the service, which are sometimes the most important, must be tendered separately, then meaning implementation, meaning training, meaning maintenance, meaning provision of a support or a kind of guarantee that can be procured. Or purchasing software, then of course in that case you have a more classical process with a large emphasis on specification. I will terminate by the perspective. We all know that it's too late to replace some proprietary bestseller, but we know also that there are very important domains where open source is becoming or had become the standard. And it's certainly the norm for all public actor, public sector asset sharing and reuse. It's difficult to go beyond the recommendation concerning an open source portfolio or mandating a portfolio. But the European Union, especially, and also the member state, could progress in regulating the reality. That was already be done in procurement with procurement directive, but also we have done that in personal data protection, of course, with the GDPR, but with the new Digital Service Act and other tool that will provide more control on the action of the famous GAFA or GAFAM, the main actor of the internet. We have also to invest on the new generation open standard, and what is important also, the legal interoperability tool. And in this tool, of course, common or compatible licensing tool that also protect the public sector investment are extremely important. And this is one of the goal by forging the EUPL. We should also bring more country and public entity to use joint procurement for developing new common public sector in emerging sector like health, for example, and other area that will become very important in the future for the European Union. That's a little bit all I had to say so far. Thank you, Federico.
Thanks a lot, Patrice. Thanks a lot for sharing tips on and also tools to be leveraged and also the insight on the legal perspective. I see one question from Gerardo asking about open standards and what is the status of the EU Catalogue.
Gerardo, could you please give some background for this question, especially the status of EU Catalogue?
So, taking parallel with the Portuguese legislation, we have a national regulation for I-14Y instead of saying interoperability. So about I-14Y, where we stated, where the government has stated a set of open standards which prefers in terms of procurement. And this also implies approaches about open data APIs, let us say. And also accessibility and in certain cases some security certifications. So the thing about this is how is the improving a catalog of European catalog of open standards, where in this case the European Commission would prefer to use in terms of procurement. In this case, it's not very clear in the case of law, but the thing here is that in public procurement in Portugal, when you state that you're going to use something from this catalog, you can actually reject tender proponents which do not follow. And so they can always ask, so if someone proposes a solution which is, we don't have this standard, but we have ours, which is much better. So the organization might tell back, either we reject your offer, or you supply a solution to be to use this standard at your own cost. And so what I was my question is about, is there a provision or an idea to make such a case, such a recommendation within the European Commission?
I don't see in the list of participants my colleague that would be better equipped than me to ask this question. What is the current situation? So we may get back to you maybe via email with more detailed answer. We have with us Open for Europe that was also helping us with the guidelines and tackling the issue of the link between open source and open standards. So maybe you are up to answering this question. Just understanding that you don't know the current developments, the recent developments.
Will reply by email later to Gerardo, because
yes, I think it's quite complex question.
Exactly.
So I would rather prefer to check it, and this is not the area that we prepared in detail for today. So do we have other questions, especially to Patrice, regarding licensing? And thank you, Patrice, for mentioning the latest Commission decision on open source licensing and reuse of Commission software. Of course, it's a decision that concerns Commission, but can be also an example for other public administrations to put legal framework for the licensing. No questions.
There is one other question from Nico, but Nico, correct me if I'm mistaken, is on, again, open standard, so I'm not sure it's addressed directly to Patrice.
Yes, so then questions to all our speakers, because we actually should finish just now, but I think that this is really interesting and important topic, and also sometimes a very hot topic. So some last questions to our speakers.
To comment, my question was directed to Patrice, but I'm not sure if he can answer that. So as it's related to open standards, yeah.
No, regarding open standard, I have no ready answer, but I can communicate it directly by mail or.
Okay, I can. We can stay in touch.
We'll include, in any case, Q&As in the presentation that we'll be distributing, so everything will be addressed there as well. Maybe we have time for one more question to any of the speakers. Otherwise, we'll be moving on and wrap it up. Okay, then maybe just the last final remark on how to get involved with OSOR. You have 4 different channels. Let's say the most active and direct might be to follow us on Twitter to stay update on any upcoming events or publication that might be published on OSOR. The second, let's say, way is to sign up for our newsletter. It's a monthly overview of the articles, publications, or useful tool that are either published on OSOR or included in one of the different resources. If you want to be even more involved, you can become part of the OSOR community. And if you have any specific knowledge or good practice, please feel free to share your insights through publication, an article, or whatever other means you prefer directly onto the OSOR website. And finally, you will see displayed the commission email address that is directly linked to OSOR. So in case of any queries, just feel free to send us an email, and then we'll come back to you as soon as possible. Apart from that, I just want to thank all the speakers and all the attendees for being part of this event. It's been a pleasure, and then also see your excitement through the chat was really great. And in the upcoming days, we'll be sharing both the recording as well as the presentation, including the Q&As. So I don't know, Monica, if you want to...
Thank you, Federico. So I would also like to thank you to all of you for starting the week with us and participating in the discussion. We will definitely get back to this topic in our case studies and webinars in the future. And a big thank you to our speakers, Johan, Rasmus, and Patrice. And also I appreciate the work of the OSOR team and support of Open Forum Europe. Thanks a lot. And by the way, one more thing, you may want to look at the slides from October 2020 webinar on the similar topic, acquisition and procurement of open source software. Jani Kilmaro from National Land Survey of Finland and Lucian Balaga from a Research and Development Director and Open Source Manager at RTE, which is Réseau Transport d'Électricité, RTE in France. They were talking about procurement practices in their organization. So there is no recording of this webinar, but the slide deck is quite self-explanatory and some other aspects were presented there. So I encourage you to go, of course, to OSOR, to our event page, and you will find this slide deck there. So once again, thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. and see you again in during our next webinar. We don't have dates yet, but they will definitely happen. And follow us on via all the channels that Federico just mentioned. Thanks and bye-bye.